today is from the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, the renowned Ukrainian. Journalist and publicist Vitaly Portnikov. Welcome, Mr. Portnikov. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Hello, Mr. Meghrebyan.
Mr. Portnikov, yesterday we were following the events in Moldova. There were elections, the second round of the presidential elections. It ended with a brilliant victory for Maia Sandu and pro-European forces over the candidate from essentially pro-Russian forces, but who positioned themselves as friends to all. And yes, it was a dramatic struggle, and now there is already reflection on what happened. In your opinion, what lessons should be learned from everything that happened in Moldova for any, let's say, post-Soviet country?
I believe that the very first lesson, the most important one, is that Russia will not easily give up its control over the former Soviet republics, and that it will use any means to maintain that control. It is important to understand that the Russian Federation was ready to use almost all the tools at its disposal to prevent Maia Sandu from winning the elections. And no one even thought about the cost, you know. This is the famous moment in Russia's attitude towards what is happening when it needs one victory and it won't stand back from the price. Firstly, the unrestrained Russian propaganda, which affects a significant number of residents in Moldova, especially in regions like the north of the country, Gagauzia, and the southern areas, not to mention the practically controlled Transnistria, from which there was also an abnormal number of voters in this process. The second point, which is also very important, is the transportation of voters. Russia was not just providing transportation. For voters, Moldovan citizens living in the country, to the Moldovan embassy in the Russian Federation in Moscow. People were transported for free. Just think about it. They were sent on charter flights to Minsk, Baku, Istanbul, that is, to places that could be reached, as they say, by direct flights, so that they could vote there. To the extent that a number of people who arrived in Istanbul were again transported by free buses to Moldova itself, so that they could participate in the voting. And they claim it was not just money, and a promise to resolve issues regarding the provision of permanent residency status in the Russian Federation for those working there. In other words, this was a serious use of the resources that were at Russia's disposal. The third is the bribery of voters. This is the so-called network created by the fugitive businessman Ilan Shor, who is currently in Moscow. And essentially, it was about them simply going door to door, bribing people, giving them huge sums of money for votes, just so these people would vote against Maia Sandu. The fourth point, which is very important, is the deception and intimidation of voters. Confusing the voters, The figure of Alexander Stoyanoglu was supposed to appear less odious to voters than, for example, the figure of the leader of the socialists, the former president of the country, Igor Dodon. Or, for example, other candidates for the presidency who were running, because everything was absolutely clear there with pro-Russian orientation. Both Dodon and the former leader of Gagauzia, Irina Vla, who also ran for president in the first round, and so on. But Stoyanoglu claimed that he was a pro-European candidate, that he supported European integration, but there should be a policy of cooperation with everyone, with the West, and with Russia, and with Ukraine. On one hand, he condemned the war, but did not name the aggressor. So, in a situation where if I want to vote against Maia Sandu, but for example do not want a pro-Russian candidate, well, I will vote for Stoyanoglu. What will change? He is not pro-Russian. He is a fighter against corruption, so to speak. And this was also the next very important point. So, we can list many such tools. But I would like to say that we must understand that these are tools that will be used by Moscow in the 2025 parliamentary campaign, because Moldova, like Armenia, is a parliamentary republic. In fact, the president of Moldova, although he is currently elected by the people, has real powers not much greater than those of the president of Armenia. But Maya Sandu is the leader of the ruling party. Her party has a majority in parliament, and because of this, she was able to implement not only her powers, but also her vision of how the country should develop. This is a very important point. And in the event that her party loses the majority or does not enter the ruling coalition in the 2025 parliament, Maya Sandu's functions will be reduced to zero. Just imagine the current president of Armenia if an opposition party comes to power. What can he do? Nothing. He has no chance to implement policies. The same situation could happen with Maya Sandu. But since we have returned to Armenia, we must understand that in Armenia, which is one of the few former Soviet republics, the citizens themselves determine the fate of the country. Russia will also use all available tools to make people vote for pro-Russian forces. And here, we must mention one very important word. That word is fear. In the Republic of Moldova, fear, I would say, was decisive for many voters who spoke out against European integration, who voted for pro-Russian candidates in the first and second rounds of the presidential elections. Fear of what? If Ukraine has chosen a pro-European path of development, and as a result, Russia responded with a large-scale brutal war, during which it destroys neighboring states, kills its inhabitants, and spares no infrastructure. It kidnaps children, and given that the connections between Russians and Ukrainians are much more serious from the perspective of other nations of the former Soviet Union than, for example, between Russians and Moldovans or Russians and Armenians, it is natural that the average voter will think, if a Russian does not spare a Ukrainian, whom we have always considered his brother, then I am not his brother. What will he do to a Moldovan? What will he do to an Armenian? He will destroy us ruthlessly because we are third-class people to him. If Ukrainians are still second-class, then we are surely third. In this sense, of course, there is only one way. Do not anger Russia, cooperate with it on its terms, and prevent the possibility of our destruction and our way of life. Therefore, Russia's war against Ukraine is also an important tool for electoral manipulation in the post-Soviet space, to intimidate the peoples of the former Soviet Union, to turn Ukraine into a showcase for the execution of those who do not agree with Russian demands, to destroy a neighboring country, making inhabitants' lives tragic, that the residents of other former Soviet republics understand submission to Russia is the only way to survive. This is also what they operate with. The same will happen with Armenia, only here, of course. Russia will also operate on the premise that only it can protect Armenia from its neighbors, and these neighbors will inevitably want to destroy Armenian statehood. And at the moment when this destruction begins to happen, Russia will simply do nothing if the leaders in Armenia are not those approved by the Kremlin. So this is a cynical intimidation of people living in other countries. And this cynical intimidation is the essence of Russian foreign policy in the post-Soviet space.
Well, indeed, certainly this is more of a criminal practice than foreign policy, as is usually done in organized crime groups.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yes, I completely agree with that. But basically, if we talk about the river of organized crime groups, because in reality, the Russian state is this organized crime group, it is clear how it operates and its powers in relation to other countries.
And they believe in this right.
Yes, and you see, they are very pleased. They boast about it. If Russian media happily showcase it on their screens, or on some of their internet resources in footage of fires, in Kyiv, how houses are burning there, how training centers are said to be. I think a few days ago, literally yesterday or the day before, a bomb hit the building of Kyiv National University. In the building of the Institute of Journalism and the Institute of International Relations, this, as they say, is definitely not a military target, right?
Of course.
Yes. I can imagine that if someone bombed a Russian university, how much screaming there would be from Russian propagandists, how they would talk about how soulless the West is, how it destroys training centers. And here it is completely calm. It is the norm. they happily show footage of these destroyed houses, of this fire. And for the Russian state, and for the citizens of the Russian Federation, such destruction of peaceful neighborhoods in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Lviv, other Ukrainian cities, where just recently Russian tourists would come, spend time, and say that they felt at home here. This is a greeting of special national pride, because you see, if over decades of your history you have not achieved anything, and you have essentially lost the civilizational competition, we can talk about both Russia and the Russian people as those who lost this civilizational competition. Moreover, it is obvious because they are essentially now, having had the chance after communism to build a normal civilized European democratic state, they chose once again to participate in criminal actions. It is clear that the only thing you can be proud of is murder, robbery, fire, the destruction of human lives. And this has become, I would say, the meaning, and in relation to everyone else, to intimidate. Again, this is a practice from the Soviet era. You remember the whole meaning of people's existence in the territory of the RSFSR. We will come from Moscow and teach you how to live. Because only we in Moscow know how to live properly. And your task is to entertain us, you understand. If you are Ukrainians, cook us borscht and dance. If you are Armenians or Georgians, organize a feast for us, so that we, as usual, get drunk to the point that we can't tell a Russian from a Frenchman, but not with that swill that we, so to speak, produce in our country. Not with some homemade moonshine, but with quality Georgian wine or Armenian brandy. That is your task. You sing to us, you feed us, you dance before us. And there was no other understanding of life for these tens of millions of people, nor is there now. And I think that in the next decade, as long as people who indulge in this disgrace are in power in Russia, there will be none.
Mr. Portnikov, by the way, I just would like to refer to what you said concerning the defeat in the civilizational competition just a bit. Do you not find it symptomatic that during Yanukovych's time, during Maidan, the desirability of Russia was mentioned explicitly, and it was pointed directly at Moscow? Now, this is considered so toxic, and such an understanding exists, as I see it, even in Moscow, that it is no longer spoken of that way. Now, this is called being friends with everyone, right?
Be friends with everyone. As Alexander Stoyanoglu once said when he was post-president, we must be friends with everyone. Haven't people appeared in not only Moldovan but also Armenian politics who say we need to be friends with everyone? That's why I say here, you don't see this today, and this is against the backdrop of war. Because after Bucha, after the atrocities of the Russian army in our country, it has become somewhat indecent to say, you know, we want to be friends only with Russia because it brings us special pleasure. We must be friends with a murderer. No. Now they say that we need to maintain good relations with everyone for various reasons, with the West to trade, with China or India to attract investments, money from the global South. And with Russia, we need to be friends so they don't cut you. This is interesting. The Stockholm Syndrome. How do they explain why we must be friends with Russia? Not because it is beneficial. Russia can kill you. They can come to your land and kill you. They can burn your house with a missile or a drone. They can leave you in the cold by cutting off your energy supplies. In other words, they can kill you, burn you, rob you, and freeze you. What can be done to prevent them from doing this? You also have to be friends with them. This is such a twisted logic. Friendship with a maniac, you understand?
Yes. Well, yes, there is a symptomatic aspect to this, but there are also completely out-of-touch figures who, like a great friend of the Armenian people, and before that, the Ukrainian people, like Constantine Zatulin, who literally a day ago spoke about how once we finish the special military operation, there will be clarity and a period of greater scrutiny regarding Yerevan's policies will begin in the relations between Armenia and Russia. He says,
Meghrebyan, Kostya is an experienced recidivist. He was also tasked with creating this CIS Countries Institute, which was an intelligence office of Lubyanka, legally, in those countries where it operates. All the people who work there are either ordinary agents or officers of the Federal Security Service. Here, in Ukraine, such intelligence operations were done by Vladimir Kornilov, who is a regular on Vladimir Solovyov's show, and an ideologist of the separation of Donbass from Ukraine. During Yanukovych's time, he prepared this operation. This is an intelligence center, a kind of criminal one. But for example, when I met Zatulin, he was still involved in the war in the former Yugoslavia. He was already involved in some provocations there. So, when I say he is an experienced recidivist, this person's main political goal is for one people to cut another. His meaning of life is in this. He finds pleasure in it. Moreover, an enormous pleasure that he is even perceived in his own circles as a person who is not to be shaken hands with. You know that even in United Russia, he is considered a marginal and people avoid him. His office is bypassed in the State Duma. This is the situation.
well then, and in his relations with Armenia, he talks about the fact that we are currently guided by such a practice that don't wake trouble while it's quiet. So,
He said the same to us when he came to Kiev before 2013. He sat here in all the television studios and similarly intimidated us. Do you understand? Moreover, for any reason. For example, if we want to refuse to glorify Stalin, you will get yours. We want to remind that World War II began in 1939, not as they still tell in 1941. You will get yours? He sat here in various television shows and taught us about life, and he said, don't wake trouble while it's quiet. It was exactly the same.
well, yes, that is, we didn't get a new record, so to speak, just the same old one.
And they never had another record. Since the times of the Caucasian Wars, it has been the same records, as you remember. If you open any Russian writer from the 19th century who either fought in the Caucasus or believed it was necessary to glorify all these crimes of their military, you will see the same thing. You understand? Under the shadow of friendly bayonets. Yes, this can simply be written in some, but these are books about Russian aggression against any neighboring country. And this is, excuse me, Lermontov, not Zatulin. If Lermontov was a bearer of such consciousness, what do you want from Zatulin? What do you want from the Sharikovs when the professors Preobrazhensky themselves were chauvinists?
Well, we can only congratulate the Moldovans on this interim but very important victory, which in general changes.
The balance between democracy and authoritarianism shifts even by one brick in favor of democracy, as the remaining battles are still ahead. So, you have no chance that I will say that this is to some extent also a restoration of justice. Because Russia has always behaved towards Moldova, its residents, and political elites extremely unfairly over all these decades. Remember, in 1991, the president of Moldova, Mircea Snegur, risking, by the way, his life, was one of the few leaders of the former Soviet republics who supported Boris Yeltsin in his confrontation with the GKCHP. No one else practically did this. Who did this at all in the post-Soviet space? Only the Baltic leaders and Snegur, and that's it. Essentially, I want to recall what the position of Levon Tropetrosyan was back then. I am trying to remember. There was no decisive reaction.
No. He was...
There was a position not to express a position, while there was a position not to express a position. Something similar was also with Leonid Kravchuk. Yes, you remember. Yes. And Snegur expressed a position, while the leaders of the so-called Transnistria, Igor Smirnov and the whole gang, supported the GKCHP. And here's what Yeltsin does. He effectively supports the Transnistrian separatists. He gives the order to the Russian army to maintain control over the territory of Moldova. He sends to Tiraspol the Vice President of Russia, Alexander Rutskoy, and the advisor to the President of Russia, Sergei Stankovic, who supports the people who had recently supported the GKCHP. In 1993, Transnistria sends its soldiers to support Alexander Rutskoy and Ruslan Kazbulatov. They participated in the planned military coup, which was supposed to end with the overthrow of Boris Yeltsin. One might think that Russia was thinking about restoring the territorial integrity of Moldova, about eliminating this smuggling cesspool for not a single minute. And so it has been for decades, you see. It is extremely unfair when a small country with not large resources and capabilities supports you while you are building democracy. And you repay her with black ingratitude, and then you even try to destroy the elections of her people. Moldovans defended their European elections and showed the Russians what justice is.
Well, as it is said in Ecclesiastes, the time has come to gather stones. And rightly so. Thank you, Mr. Portnikov. Wishing for a swift victory and peace in your country. Glory to Ukraine. All the best.
Best. Glory to heroes.